Record.
Hi, Haley.
Hey everybody. Hello, Brian.
I want you to meet my friend Lorelei Sensabaugh. Lorelei, did I pronounce the last name right? Sensabaugh?
That's correct. Sensabaugh. Yep, you got it.
Great. And Lorelei, first of all, I think I told you prior to this that Haley is a good friend. We started doing this a couple of years ago, and all we do is have a conversation. And in corresponding with you, you said that you'd like to talk about the whole issue of gender dysphoria with a focus on dysphoria. Yeah.
Sure.
Start us out, would you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so basically, I talk about gender dysphoria, I think, a little bit differently than I hear most people use it, because when we talk about gender dysphoria, so I need to sort of talk about what gender is, and then I'll talk about what dysphoria is, because I don't think people tend to break those two apart. We tend to just talk about gender dysphoria, and because of that, people who are cisgender, someone who's cisgender means that your sex assigned at birth aligns with the gender identity that you have, so your inner sense of self. When we talk to people like that, I don't think they understand really necessarily what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So to really quickly talk about gender, so again, it's your internal sense of self, right? And everyone has like their internal sense of, who they are as a person, how masculine or how female they are, or, maybe you're neither one of those. You may be agender. There's a lot of terms there that I can unpack if you'd like me to. But dysphoria, how I try to talk to people about it is can I ask, does Haley know like my explanation of this? Because Brian, you know it.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so Haley, can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
Are you left or right-handed? Or are you
Right.
right-handed? So what happens when you use your left hand to like do writing or like anything that kind of takes like a lot of effort?
Well, for writing, it's just very uncoordinated.
Mhm. Does it kind of feel wrong in like a certain sense to use your left hand like for a long period of time?
It doesn't feel wrong, it's just exhausting.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard people describe it in different ways. Exhausting is one way. Some people describe it as being like a little bit wrong. Like there's this feeling that it's kind of off to use their left hand instead of using their right hand. And there's other examples I can give for this because I've met people ambidextrous and this example does not work. But I think of wrongness is just what dysphoria is. That's all it means. Is that dysphoria is that sense of offness or wrongness that you may have about something. So another example I give to people is like if you ever lost something, like if you've lost your set of keys, there's kind of that moment when you realize, that you're missing, it's not where it's supposed to be, right? And there's that feeling that, it's not right. That feeling that, it should be somewhere, like it should be there. That's all dysphoria is. And everyone, I think, experiences it at some point in their lives. So now I need to be careful here. I'm transgender, I'm trans feminine, and I have gender dysphoria. Not everyone who is transgender necessarily has gender dysphoria. To be transgender just means that your gender identity doesn't align with the sex you were assigned at birth, all right? Gender dysphoria is, again, that sense of just offness or wrongness attached to your gender, right? Your internal sense of self. So for me, it just never aligned. I was assigned male at birth, and I never identified as being male. And I always, again, had that sense of it being wrong or it being off. I don't know if that like helps in any way. I don't know if you're both.
It does.
I'm keeping track of
It helps a lot.
questions.
What's that, Haley?
I'm keeping track of questions.
Oh, okay.
Oh wait, do we have to chat for this? I'm sorry, like do we actually get like questions in real time?
No,
No,
my own
Oh,
question.
you all have questions. Okay.
yeah, she has.
I kind of want to pause here actually, because do you all have anything you'd like to ask me here before I go on?
Well,
'Cause it's a lot.
you use an interesting word and
Mhm.
lots of interesting words going on here.
Sure.
And let me just give you some context of where I'm coming from. I did purposely research any of the words that you want to talk about today, specifically because I want your context. I want to understand how you're living in your world with these words. But you do use one word, which is I was assigned this gender at birth.
Mhm.
Who assigned it to you?
So essentially the doctor, right? Because like your birth certificate, it has that little letter on it, either usually says M or F.
So
And
it
yeah,
was assigned to you based on your physical body.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's usually how that goes. And there's some debate over using that terminology because, again, the truth is I was probably, again, I identify much more as female than male. So I was probably always that way from birth, right? And so some people don't like using the terminology sex assigned at birth. Well, sex assigned at birth, I think, actually kind of makes it more direct about what it is. But some transgender people kind of object to that terminology. It's all of it's kind of shifting. So
It's
Yeah.
but this is your talk.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to describe some of the terms because sometimes I think for someone who's coming at it from the outside, it's bewildering. And even as someone who is transgender, it's kind of just helpful to like, be reminded like this is what this means. Like sometimes different people like different labels, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Okay.
And not everybody in the transgender community is on the same page.
No.
And that's hard when you go through all that you go through to claim yourself, your right self, to have others snipe at you because of the word you're using or the definition you're offering is hard. That happened to me in terms of the gay community. I didn't know where I belonged because I got it from both sides, from the church, Catholic Church, and from, far left in the gay community, that I shouldn't be a Catholic and gay. And sort of, you thought you were at home, and you're not prepared really for some of the sniping that can go on. Do you agree with that, Lorelei?
I absolutely do. And actually, to be honest, I'd like to talk about it the way that I just did because I actually really would like to explain it to cisgender, what it's like to be transgender. I think too often we kind of just assume that like you'll never quite fully understand what it's like. And I think actually being able to kind of describe it even a bit metaphorically, it at least gives you something that you can latch onto, even if, again, if it's not your lived experience. It's at least something that, mentally you can kind of try to begin to understand what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important.
I think that, I don't know if you would consider this true, but from my experience, knowing since I was little that I was gay and not fitting in, and not being able to talk about it and not understanding it, I didn't understand why I had the feelings that I had. I looked it up. I tried to find something, couldn't find much information about it. And so I always felt like I was other, and that if they ever discovered the other, my whole life would change. I'd lose every privilege I had. Does that ring a bell?
Actually, can I bring that because I was reading, I think, as you know, I communicate with you because I read one of your books that you read like I think a quarter of a century ago now. So.
Yeah.
But you talk about sort of having the secret self, the self that's kind of ashamed in a sense because you know that you're different, but you don't know why you're different. And for you, it was being gay. For me, it was being transgender. And I actually identify as trans feminine. I'm on hormone replacement therapy, but I kind of do identify a bit as non-binary as well. Non-binary means that you're not really male or female, because I don't completely identify as female, and that's like a very kind of nice distinction there. But when I was younger, to be honest, I had the terms gay, lesbian, bisexual, straight, but they didn't mean anything to me because I couldn't tell you if I was a boy or a girl. And like they all fell apart, and I didn't have pansexual back then to kind of help me out with it. That's a term that means that you're attracted to all genders, basically, kind of irrespective. So I couldn't even get at my own sexual orientation because I couldn't get my gender identity. So yeah, I totally relate.
I've never heard the term trans feminine, and I feel like I've been, in the field a long time as a sexuality educator. I like it a lot, but would you define it in your own terms?
Absolutely. So gender, the way that we talk about gender identity has changed so much, even as I've been like learning about it. There used to be like this gender gingerbread person, just all these like crazy ways of putting it. It was really common back in the day to put it as a spectrum. So someone who's trans feminine, again, I was assigned male at birth. I identify more as female. So trans feminine means that I'm trying to get closer to femininity. Someone who's a binary transgender woman just identifies as a woman, right? I'm a bit non-binary, which means I don't completely identify as being a woman, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
The mirror journey. This is an expression someone taught me instead of using opposite to say it's the mirror journey, but it's someone who is assigned female at birth who identifies as being, male or masculine. They would be trans masculine, right? So that's how that works.
Haley.
Yeah, Lorelei, can you share, sort of going back to your example of using left hand if you're right-handed, and that sort of sense of something's off.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain or share how it felt for you being in having a male body, but not feeling the male word or the terms that we use? What does that feel like for you? What did it feel like for you?
So it's a really good question because when I talk about gender dysphoria, it wasn't a consistent feeling. So I kind of start you off actually on the lower end of the spectrum, as I'll call it, because I'm going to compare it to anxiety in a little bit. But for your question, it was alienating. I didn't fit in with the boys. I remember by middle school, I sat alone at my own table because I didn't fit in with the boys at all. I wasn't like them and I knew it. I didn't fit in with the girls either. And a lot of that had to do, to be honest, with a bit of kind of misogyny that was aimed at me because being, there's a term sissy, right? Like it wasn't acceptable to be feminine and to have having a male body. Everyone assumed I was a guy, and to have, those characteristics where I was feminine, I got ridiculed quite a lot for it. It just wasn't safe. So yeah, that's how it felt.
Would you say that like the term "it wasn't safe," would you say that that was sort of a greater headline of your growing up, just not feeling safe in your physical being?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, not just safe in my own physical being, but not feeling safe kind of externally as well,
Right.
just how other people treated me. So yeah, absolutely.
And did you think you would grow out of it? Like, just personally, I know that we have a lot of noise and saying, oh, it's just a phase and all that stuff, but you personally, did you think it would be something you would grow out of? Or did you know very early on this is going to be a life challenge?
That is a great question, actually. And I kind of want to bring it up because I actually didn't come out to myself as being transgender until I was in my mid-20s. But looking back, I kind of knew even when I was 12 or 13, because I really debated with myself, am I a boy, am I a girl? I'm sitting by myself for a reason, right? And at that point, I didn't actually have the word transgender, really, to be honest with you. Because when I was little, the first transgender people I saw in the media were binary. And so you see, these are people who knew from a young age. And to answer your question, I mean, they would have said that it was just static. It wasn't changing for them. And I come to really identify that way until I was a little bit older. And so that actually held me back in quite a lot of ways. To answer your question, though, I would actually say, looking back now, it was true when I was little. I mean, I didn't really think I would grow out of it. I certainly didn't grow out of it. I kind of had that sense back then that this was just always a part of me. And it was a key part of, my identity. So, yeah.
Couple questions for you, Lorelei. On your Facebook page that we're friends, you list Florida State, University of Virginia, and the University of North Texas. Did you get degrees from all three?
I did, as a matter of fact. So I did my bachelor's at the University of Virginia. That was in person. I got my master's in library science from Florida State University. And then I still technically work, that's kind of my former job, though. I have a background in archives. And so I got a certificate in archival administration, I think was what it was called, from the University of North Texas. And that was online. But yeah.
Did you consider yourself a super achiever? And if so, did it have anything to do with the trans feminine that was going on for you?
What a wonderful question. Yes, actually, and looking back, I used overwork as my coping mechanism, to be brutally honest. That was other people. There's all kinds of vices that someone could get into trying to cope with something that is painful. And for me, it was overwork. And I can't look back at that and say it was the worst way I could have lived. I bought my house when I was 24. I don't really regret that. But certainly now it's something where I'm aware of it. I'm trying to kind of curb it back, like rein myself in. And I'm much happier than I used to be. So yeah.
Haley?
Yeah. I'm going back into the whole gender thing.
Okay, go.
There's a wonderful, one of my favorite, or the favorite number one book of mine is called The Kabbalion, and it is the Hermetic knowledge. And in that, they have a chapter about gender and sex. And they say that the way that we use it now is very convoluted and completely gone off on a tangent that doesn't really hold the authenticity. So when you were talking about it, sort of what really resonated with me was this idea that there's this balance between masculine and feminine where you're neither. And sort of this idea that we think that that's wrong today. And I'm straight. I like guys, and I'm happy, fortunate. I've had a body dysphoria, but I'm comfortable being feminine, but I also have to learn how to be feminine. I have to learn how to be masculine. I have to learn how to balance it. But I do personally believe that the way that we see gender and the choice that we have to make, that we're either feminine or masculine, sort of goes against our nature. Have you read that book, or I know that we think it's wrong to see gender as neutral. Do you think that we would all be much happier if we were given the option of just being neutral on the gender subject? And I offer this to you too, Brian.
You go first, Lorelei.
There's kind of a lot to unpack with that question, actually. And I do know of some parents who now they will not gender their child at birth. They will use they, them pronouns for them. I think they kind of even at some point allow the child to decide their own name. Like they give them kind of like a start off name that they use, and then at a certain age, they're like, well, you can pick your name, you can pick your gender. I don't really have too much of like a stance on that. Because I will say also, like being non-binary, I actually identify a bit as bigender, which is kind of interesting because I technically identify a bit as both male and female. And so to come out from the perspective of someone who's agender and perhaps identifies as neither, I just can't really speak to that myself. But
Mhm.
great question.
Mhm. Lorelei, if I can, two just personal questions. One, when you were naming yourself in terms of Lorelei, uh, it's a beautiful name. Where did it come from?
Thank you. I loved mythology as a kid. I read a lot of Greek and Roman mythology, and I find it so interesting I picked this name because I must have read it as a child. It's a Germanic name, actually. It means murmuring rock. And there's a rock out on the Rhine River. It's called the Lorelei. Um, and I think my understanding is it's the city of mermaids. That was probably the total of my understanding as a kid. When I went back and looked up as an adult, it's like the mermaid as a siren, and it was this mermaid luring sailors to their death on the rock.
Yeah.
Like interpretation, I first think of like the mermaid side of it, but yeah, I must have read as a kid.
I think it's interesting how we take this very innocent sort of meaning of a word, which was very feminine and very in power, and it shifts to a destruction.
Yeah, I think that we all are doing our best to get through an understanding of who we are, and we come up with words, right? And future generations may not use those words, and they may not explain things in the same way, and they may not feel the same challenges. Younger gay people today have no sense usually of what it took to come out. They think, well, why didn't you just come out? Because I didn't want to get beaten up, kicked out of the family, and fired from my job. So, your question, Haley, about gender, and I sort of find myself really embracing the feminine in me, but I'm not bigendered, and I'm not non-binary. I've had a male persona my whole life, and it sort of works for me. But Lorelei, if I can, does your gender feminine impact your sexuality and your dating?
This is actually, this kind of goes back to something Haley was talking about a little bit earlier. No, because sexual orientation and gender identity are really not related at all. And I think that's something that I find definitely to be true. There are people who come out as being, female, and they identify as transgender lesbians. And I'm someone, it's kind of a great question. I think I'm actually probably more attracted to men than women. I still like the term pansexual, but I'm kind of finding that I think the term is androsexual for being more attracted to men. So yeah, that's kind of been a learning process for me. That I think when I was 12, I knew that was how I operated, but it took me actually having the right body, to really begin to to really have it be right.
And dating?
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, to be honest, this is also something in your book that I was kind of reading about. I think you wrote about what it was like, dating women as like a young teenager, and that being the pressure that was on you. And I had the same thing, right? I was, told that I was supposed to be straight, essentially. I dated women during my teens, and I really didn't date in college because I knew that I felt more feminine than my girlfriends, to be honest. Like sometimes I was kind of worried about that. And then I dated gay men, which they like men. I mean, I'm not really a man. That was kind of a problem. I did some transgender people, and now I did kind of all around. But I'm kind of coming around to I think where I really want to be. So yeah.
You're okay. I met Haley and Lorelei. I met a person at the conference that I was at recently on Catholic and gay, and the person was non-binary and said that they were recently experiencing themselves as asexual, that they weren't attracted to either sex in their awareness, and they were quite content where they are as a non-binary asexual person. I've also met and have friends who were transgender, who when they transitioned or when they affirmed their gender, affirmed their true sex, their sexual orientation got changed. You know, that one of my friends was born with a female a body, transitioned to male, and thought that they were going to be attracted to women because they identified as lesbian before this, and then they ended up, after the hormones, being attracted to men. Have you talked with anybody who's had similar experiences, Lorelei?
So it'd be interesting, I think, but it'd be so anecdotal to try to do a study on that because it's people self-reporting what their sexual orientation was before versus after. And I will say for myself, so I talked about having to unpack like what my sexual orientation was and my gender identity, and I couldn't really do it. But what I figured out was I could imagine dating women as a guy. I didn't feel satisfied with that. I could imagine dating, as a boy, like other boys as a boy. That wasn't as satisfying, it was better. And then when I imagined dating them as a woman or a girl, that was really where I wanted to be. And as an adult, I've just come back around to that. And so sometimes I think what happens is there's all these social pressures, to act a certain way, to date certain people. And I think sometimes when you finally, everything's aligning for you in terms of your body, I think you're then finally able to really get at your sexual orientation. So I couldn't really tell you if it actually is switching or if it's just them coming to what was always true, right?
Yep. Because it's your perspective is different now than it was when you were younger, and you're getting more of a bird's eye view of yourself growing up and the feelings that you had and where you are now. First of all, I think it's wonderful. You need to know that. I think because Lorelei read Sex Camp, Haley, and there are several transgender people in Sex Camp. One of whom I just adore personally. Michael was the person who, anyway. So I just want to say, if I can, that I loved your costume for Gay Pride, and I love the fact that they put you on the float. That in New York City Gay Community Center, LGBTQ plus Community Center, had Lorelei on their float.
Amazing.
She was in this fantastic green plumes, and it was an amazing outfit.
Thank you so much.
Love that. Lorelei, in your journey to date, and in sort of coming more into acceptance of who you are and being able to define that for yourself, how do you start? Do you start with the physical? Do you start with the mental? Do you start with the emotional? Do you start with the spiritual? Or do you do all of them at the same time in little chunks?
That's kind of an interesting question, actually, because I don't know that I've ever really fully broken it out like that. I guess I can say from my journey, I found the term finally non-binary when I was like 26, which would be about 5 years ago now. And I realized that was the term I've been missing the entire time, right? Like once I had that, I was like, oh, I'm this. And then non-binary, not everyone who's, again, it's kind of true of everything, but not everyone who's non-binary identifies as transgender, right? But I realized, oh no, I'm transgender. Like I've always been kind of adjacent to that community. Now I actually really am part of it. I began to understand I had dysphoria. I didn't fully understand what that meant until even recently, actually, until I started HRT, really. But it was physical at first, because there was that profoundly physical sense of something being wrong, right? And for years, I was like, well, I know I have this. I don't know that I need to transition, right? Because then that's kind of an extra step. I mean, it involves coming out in like a way, there's all those physical changes that become really apparent to other people. I had to be worried about the fact that back in 2020, I could have been fired, before the Supreme Court decision. So there were all these kind of pressures. And really, for me, it did start with the physical sense. I recognized that actually my dysphoria wasn't static. I thought it was like steady. It was not. It was actually getting worse, even in my late 20s. And so I need a transition. And I'm very happy I did. I've heard people say it's the difference between living in black and white and living in color, and it is. And I thought it was an exaggeration, but it really is. So yeah.
And sorry,
please.
As you're continuing to go through sort of that physical change, do you do any additional, or is there any inclination to sort of look into sort of mental, emotional, and supporting yourself from those aspects? Or do you feel like focusing on the physical kind of checks the boxes of those?
So that's a great question. Actually, I really should come back around to talking a bit more about dysphoria to fully answer your question. But to give a bit of a shorter answer, I'm of course doing therapy. Like you do need to do therapy for like certain things, especially, but it's really important just to have someone to talk to going through a process that's kind of this intense. I also lead a support group at the LGBTQ center that I'm a part of. So I definitely have like ways of feeling support, especially in terms of like mental, mental state. Spirituality, I kind of identify as agnostic. I sort of have my own sort of like moral kind of sense of the world. It is important to me. It's kind of tied to like my gender in the sense that I always felt sort of excluded by certain religious communities because of being transgender. But it's a little bit, it's kind of outside of this, right? I kind of consider it a little bit separate.
And how did you find support?
I kind of looked around for quite some time, actually. I went to all kinds of different support groups. There's not too many. I live in a rural area, so there's really not that much around me. When I went to the one, there's basically one to the north and one to the south, like some LGBTQ groups. And I went to the one in the north. It was interesting because it was people who are a bit younger than me and all transmasculine. And they're talking about, parts of themselves that they don't like that are, the mirror of what I was after. And I have to be honest with you, it was very uncomfortable. I didn't really stay with that group. When I went to the one in the South, it was older transgender women, which kind of has its own set of issues, but those are people who I could relate to more. So yeah, now I have my own group. So
Nice.
yeah.
And this is a sort of I'm concerned about how transgender people are being treated in the country right now, and also how this Project 2025 has transgender as one of the targets. And I was told at this conference, and you may confirm or say, no, that's not true, that sometimes when transgender people go to the hospital for basic services, they're turned away. It's not that they're there for anything related to affirmation of their gender. They're going for something else. And the hospital, and I'm assuming it's a religious hospital, turns them away. Have you heard about that?
I think I've heard about it. I haven't really read into so much. I think you're right. It has to be religious because I think that's the only exemption that would allow someone to deny coverage like that. And I think those are the only cases that I've heard of. I think it's actually unfortunately very common for someone who's transgender. If they do get an appointment, sometimes people like to assume that it's because if you're on transit, like if you're transitioning, right? They'll assume it's because of the medications and stuff. We could call it transgender broken arm syndrome, where you try to say this other thing that actually is, and they're like, no, it's something else. Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Sorry,
Go
Brian.
ahead. No, please.
I was going to say, one of the questions that I did want to ask you is that there is a lot of media, and obviously this Project 2025 is such a big thing right now, or is sort of being highlighted at this point in time, which if you're not in your community, you're kind of looking from the outside looking in. And obviously there's an enormous amount of assumptions with that. As a person that is transgender and dealing with all of these different tentacles that come with being you, how scary is it, or how is your life how is this personally impacting you? And do you wake up afraid every morning, or right now is things still kind of chill for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So I worry about people in other states, to be quite candid, because I live in Virginia. And so Virginia, there are protections for somebody like me. Now, if the legislature changes, that might very well change. The governor of the state has been able to target younger people in terms of school policies, but I'm not of school age. So I'm insulated in some ways from this. I am, of course, very worried about the future, and depending on who's in positions of power, that might really be able to impact me, much more profoundly. And certainly I'm very aware of what's happening, in terms of Virginia's legislature, in terms of, my state. But a lot of this is kind of decided at the state level. And so it's really, it's kind of a matter of like the geography of where I'm at.
Okay. So for now, being in Virginia, that's a good state for you.
Right. Yeah.
Would you consider moving if sort of Virginia changed legislature? Would you consider moving to a state that is friendlier, or would you
Absolutely
stay a bit too futuristic?
I would consider moving to a state that's more friendly. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I work remotely, so I don't have to, I'm not tied to like a geographic place. I'm not tied to like a specific location. So for me, that's an easy decision to make, but not so much for other people.
There are parents who are they're moving because their child is transgender and will not get the services that that child needs. So the parents are taking the child to a state where they're going to get the kind of medical attention that's required. And I think that's great. I was wondering about your own family, Lorelei, in terms of their support. It's what strikes me is that you're a really kind person. And I picked this up in person and on your Facebook page. And that meant that to me, that you were a really kind person when you were a child. And even though you sat by yourself, at lunch, your mom and dad have to have seen what a good kid you were. And other parents have to have commented about what a nice, child you have. So that hasn't changed. But how did your folks respond?
So I will say this, my dad accepted me, my mom has not accepted me. And actually I see my parents on Saturday. And so it'll be very interesting to see how, because I'm kind of playing it nice with my mom and allowing her to use my now old name, and old pronouns and everything. And I'm going to show up and I'm not going to hide anything because I'm pretty far along in this process at this point.
Mm-hmm.
When was the last time you saw her?
Huh?
When was the last time you saw your mom?
It might have actually been a few months ago now. It's kind of been a while. And actually, to kind of respond to your earlier point, yes, other parents said that I was, a nice child and quite kind. My own parents, I had a neglectful childhood, actually, rough childhood. And so there's a little bit of that tension there still, but that's kind of in the past quite a bit. But yeah, it was, yeah.
So you'll
not necessarily see that.
I just saw this on a TV show from Australia that we watched last night, where the person was meeting with their disapproving mother, and they showed up at the lunch in drag, because that's what they do. Drag, they have their own persona, and the mother went crazy.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, left. So, but that's relevant in terms of when you put on your makeup the day that you're meeting with your mom and dad. You're presenting yourself as Lorelei. You're not doing anything to soften the blow, right? Because it's you. They either accept you or they don't accept you.
Right. And like I said, so my mom is actually the only member of my family who hasn't accepted me. I told her about this back in April and she repressed it pretty immediately, which is really unfortunate, but it was kind of to be expected. Her religious beliefs, the people she follows in terms of her religious beliefs are very much, transgender is a sin. It's very derogatory. It's very kind of hateful in a sense. And that's what she's been led to believe, and even though my younger brother is gay, respectfully, like accepting someone who's gay still doesn't extend to someone who's transgender necessarily.
Right, it's the next step.
And so yeah.
Give her a copy of Sex Camp. See if she'll read it.
I think it's one of my greatest fascinations with humanity is this idea of resilience or old soul or whatever it is that sort of some people manage to hold on to their core values. And Brian sort of highlighted it, that you held on to kindness, even though you may not have received much kindness from sort of primary caregivers. What is it about you that made you not only hold on to sort of your true identity in terms of I'm not comfortable being this or the assigned gender, but what is it about you that made you hold on to kindness or hold on to those values that so easily get eroded when we have sort of chaotic lives early on?
This will seem like perhaps a bit of a strange answer, but defiance. I felt very defiant about it, and the way that other people tried to define me, even when I was younger. I mean, so I'm quite intelligent, right? You list off the degree.
I would say you're really intelligent.
When I was really, really little, I had this kid who tried to tell me I was dumb, and I was very impressionable as like a very young child. I was like in kindergarten, and I kind of repeated it. And this teacher sat down and said, "You're not dumb. Like, why are you saying this? Like, why are you saying this? You're not." And then afterwards, again, I'm quite intelligent. Like, it's pretty well established, like as I got older. And it was like, why did I ever allow someone to define me, right? Like, why did I ever, from that young age, I was able to take that lesson. I'm so grateful to that teacher. And I held on to that. And that's what really became a shield for me. I kept my values because I learned not to really allow people to define me in that sense. Again, I wish I had the terms when I was younger to really be able to say what I was, but it just wasn't there then. So,
but also back then, I mean, the level of education and the level of awareness wasn't there. And that sort of leads into my next question, which is, I don't think anybody with a sense of awareness can say that it's easy to be in America or to be an American right now. And there is a lot of fear and there is a lot of talk, but from what I see, even though the talk is scary, at least people are still talking about it, and at least it's getting a platform now which is national, and everybody is asking the question, what is this transgender thing, or what is this transsexual thing? Do you see that as a benefit, or do you see that it's just wrong, 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 and it needs to change?
So can you repeat the last part of your question again? I was following up until I think the question itself.
Yeah, so like with all of the media right now, and especially like right now, Project 25 being in the headlines, and sort of the pillar of one of the pillars of Project 25 is transgender rights.
Right. Oh,
It's
right.
not talking about it in a very kind way, but it is making people ask the question, what is transgender? Is
Yeah,
that
but
good, or is that
I think as there's so many things in our culture now, it's polarized. And I think the way that it's covered in more sort of left wing, or even, I mean, centrist, I think is still fairly good, but when it comes right wing media, you know, it's very hostile, right? And that coverage affects people's perceptions of it. And quite frankly, it affects the questions that they're going to ask about this and the place that they're coming from. And so I would give you different answers depending on specific news sources. I will say there are some very left-wing sources that still have this incredibly wrong. And I think one of the issues is not having someone who is transgender writing about this,
right?
because it's not an informed perspective, respectfully. And some of these news organizations do a really bad job actually of covering it. I see this especially in terms of like transition care, because so much of that's targeted. I think there's still a lot of inaccurate information that's kind of said about that. But yeah, so I think that'll be that's kind of answer your question. Let's see, it's something else.
Kaylee, I think it's any publicity is good in the long term, and as you suggested, because at least like Anita Bryant, you know, made the word gay known internationally, you know, and Lorelei, you're probably too young to even know who Anita Bryant is, but she was an anti-gay crusader in Miami, and so in many ways she did us a favor by uniting the community. And I think that can happen too with the transgender community, you know, pulling together. But I want to say that when I was doing diversity training in corporations, the audiences were very receptive to new information on what it means to be transgender. You know, I would take them through sex, gender identity, gender role, gender expression, and we'd talk about it. And this Project 2025 totally opposes diversity, and equity, and inclusion training. You know, they don't want any white person to feel guilty about their past. And it's just awful because there's so much joy to be found in diversity. You know, so many more people that you can relate to if you have the opportunity to learn. But if you shut it down, how are people supposed to find out?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think you're right. Yeah.
And, you know, my answer, I've faced these questions a lot over the last 2 weeks, not just from a US perspective, but also from sort of the global scale. And I think it looks really terrible on the surface and we can go into fear. But I also think, you know, what's different when I was growing up, when you were growing up, Brian, and also Lorelei, when you were a young boy sitting at the table alone, what's different is that the avenues for information are so much more expanded and diversified that they are literally becoming beyond control. And so I think that these subjects can be put into the media, but the access to information is still there.
Yeah.
And I think the diversity of information channels is still there. It's the traditional channels that are getting questioned right now. And I hate that that's how this is being presented, but I do still see it as a silver lining that these people are so threatened right now that they're grasping at any straw to put some level of control in. And for me, that's just a sign that you've gone beyond control now.
Yeah. Haley, I agree with you that, you know, like the New York Times has had twice as many articles about Biden as they have about Trump. But social media, you know, Lorelei's Facebook page is a great place for people to learn, right? And, you know, if I talk about it on my page, just a great place for people to learn
Absolutely.
the truth, right? So we have other means of reaching people to educate them beyond just the media, that's often owned and run by a conservative.
And I
Go
do
ahead.
think that's better. I do think, for some of us, we have our lives look different, but the experience and the feeling of sitting alone at the table because you don't feel like you fit in and something's off. Many of us have that, and we sort of ask the question, why me? Why did I go through this? Why was life so tough? I think it's so that we can be those individual teachers and be that resource when all of the greater resources are so convoluted and censored.
Uh-huh.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah.
Like, this is our time to take responsibility for our service.
Lorelei, I always say that the messenger is the message. That, when I would get up on stage or I was in front of a room, people were looking at me more than they were thinking about homosexuality. They were deciding whether they liked me. And once they decided they liked me, then my being gay became much easier for them. And I was wondering, to what extent, I mean, I know you're talking about archival work, which is behind doors, you're off by yourself. I was wondering, to what extent do you see yourself as the messenger on the issue of being transgender or trans feminine or non-binary?
I think I agree with the idea that I think how people perceive me is extremely important. And you're right, as soon as they perceive me as being likable, as someone they wish to get to know better, someone they wish to listen to and can kind of respect and trust a bit, it becomes easier to give the message. And they do listen to me, they do believe me. I've had a few interactions now with people who are parents of transgender children, or other people who are transgender but are kind of struggling with some of the terms. And it's been wonderful in a way to save these people that trip from point A to point B that took me years, that took me so long to understand some of these terms. And now I have this very shorthand way of expressing it, and I can really relate to them. And I think that's very powerful. I will say, though, I haven't put myself in as messengers because I'm still transitioning, where I've really been kind of confronted with something. So I haven't put myself in kind of very hostile places.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit speaking to the choir, I think, sometimes, but yeah.
But the choir needs to grow too. It's not as if the choir members are all at the same place.
Yep.
We often say that, oh, you're preaching to the choir. Well, I energize the choir. People listen and they got excited about themselves and wanting to tell their folks or wanting to, come out at work. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's wonderful that you're a resource for these people who don't otherwise know where to turn.
In keeping with the theme of the messenger and the message, you mentioned you had this wonderful teacher that kind of lit up that defiant spark in you. Have there been any other teachers, living or dead, books, or that you kind of point to and be like, that was a key point or that was a key message?
Yeah, there's been several along the way. In terms of being transgender, there was a book called Trans Like Me that was written by someone by the name of, I think, C.N. Lester. I should have it like right behind me. And that was really how it helped me realize I was non-binary. Like listening to this person's experience, reading this person's experience, I was like, I can relate to them. Kind of go back to what Brian was saying. I found people I could relate to. And it was kind of rough, actually, because, when I attended that group that had older transgender women, I didn't always relate to them. Sometimes they had very specific ways that they related to themselves that just didn't apply to me, to be quite candid. Sometimes even you're in community, you can feel a little bit of distance, right? So the books kind of helped in a way. Also, Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe. I might pronounce that last name wrong, but my apologies. I've actually met them. And they're the person who gave me the term mirror journey, which I think they got from a different book. But their book was really good. It's a graphic novel. There's been some really great resources, especially recently. I think more has been coming out. So
And last question. Sorry, Brian.
No, Haley, go.
Told you so many questions for you. My next question with the message and the messenger. Again, my favorite book, The Kabbalion, mentions that you only get the message when you're ready to hear it. Would you say that that's true for you?
Could you unpack that just a little bit more for me?
We only receive the teacher or the message when we're ready for it, when we're ready to hear it, when we're ready to do something with it.
I think there's truth in that, because I think in some of these books I read, I've gone back and kind of reread them, right? And there's certain things that I wouldn't quite necessarily say is that I wasn't ready to take the message. I will say that I wasn't quite looking for it, right?
Right.
Sometimes I come to it with a different question and I end up reading something. I'm like, oh, well, there it was right there the entire time. I just kind of missed it before because I was looking for something else at the time. So I think that gets to your question.
You're right. Sorry, Brian, your turn.
No, I was just, Lorelei, you were saying I'm still transitioning, and I think it's been a 9-month process to date.
About a year, actually 8 days away now from the year mark.
Is that right? But I immediately thought, well, I think we all transition throughout our life. There is no point at which you're going to stop transitioning, because it means getting wiser. It means learning more about the world and ourselves and how we're in it, and masculinity, femininity, because after you, Lorelei, there's going to be a generation who thinks you're out of it. You're using terms they would never use, right? Just as you gave me feedback that we don't use the term transsexual, right? I do need to tell you this, though. A friend of mine is a surgeon, famous in the U.S. Her name is Christine McGinn. She self-identifies as transsexual, and she says all of my patients are transsexual. So that's generational. That's,
I was going to say, it's very generational.
Yeah, it is. And that's, I think, the issue between you and the older women, that you were meeting with. They're a different generation than you. Right. These different perspective on the world, on themselves, different role models they had. So I think it's hard. Haley, you too. I mean, you're great, but there's going to be a younger generation that says, "Oh,
and they're already coming up." Like, honestly, I'm the people that I think I've taught, a bit egotistical, but the people that I've sort of helped along their journey and sort of got them to where they're now ready to springboard, I can see them I'm helping them sort of go back out into the world now as sort of being of service. And I'm going like, dude, that's my job. You're doing my job.
Right.
And I always wanted that, but there is sort of that ego part of you where you're just like, And I think with that change, things change so much. Just the way that math is done today, I'm just like, I couldn't even get past 2nd grade right now. I can't understand the lingo that some of these, like, there's TikTok videos now about how to figure out what English is with with the kids and the slang that they're using. And I'm just like, it's too much. I want to go home.
Right. I take comfort in looking at the sand in the hourglass. It's getting lower and lower. I don't have to keep up with all this stuff.
And I think
I had my turn.
Yeah. And I think, that's not just a sign of age. I think it's a sign of the times and a sign of the collective, is that we are facing this information overload. And I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. In that recognition of information overload, we now get to seek for accurate information. And I think that comes back to us. We are here to be of service. We are here to share our experience with those who are willing to listen, who resonate with it. And honestly, our service is to springboard other people so that they now have the confidence to share their experience in that language. But again, we're always transitioning, when you think you have confidence in what you're sharing, you have to learn new confidence. It's never
or you get brutal and break. You have to be pliant. In fact, Lorelei, when you met with those older women, when they were coming out, it was called gender identity disorder. It was called a disorder. And that name has been changed by all of these professional groups to talk about gender dysphoria. And, it's going to keep changing. And I think, go ahead.
Chime in and say, so I have a few things to say. One is, actually, I've been doing research for something, and I'm realizing, so there's something called the WPATH, which is the World Organization that assigns like transgender health, like they do the guidelines. I believe their journal used to be called the Journal of Transgenderism, and it was maybe about 5 years ago, it became the Journal of Transgender Health, because we don't use the term transgenderism anymore. I mean, it's considered to be kind of an offensive term as well. I will say, actually, though, to kind of what was said earlier, I'm looking forward to the new terms, though. I'm actually looking forward to the way in which it might change as I'm getting older, because I often find myself when I'm reading older works by LGBTQ people, I'm very interested in how they came to identify themselves, the terms that they had that were available, and then kind of how they came to it themselves. Because often, if they didn't get the right term, they often kind of made up their kind of own understanding, kind of like I did. And these new terms, even someone who's older can come back and look at something like this, like pansexual, for example, and be like, oh, that gets even more at like who I am. So I'm
Hmm.
kind of hoping that maybe that process happens, because
Yeah.
I'd love that. Yeah.
It's like the word queer. People in my generation hate it.
Mhm.
You know, we add it because we don't want to exclude anybody, but every time we do, we get this, this lump in our throat because that's what we were called. What are you, queer? And it was terrifying, that word. And I know that there's this effort to take the pain out of the word and empower it to be something positive, but that's a long process.
Well, can I say I also actually was called that word as basically a slur. And so I initially had that same sort of thing. And I've also had to kind of like unlearn that negative connotation that I have memories associated with. So I totally understand.
Is that right? You were called queer too? Or are you worried
Yeah,
about
I think I'm technically at that generational break where perhaps it stopped being the insult. But yeah, I
it?
was probably around the cusp of it.
If your mom does not accept you when you see her and whenever it is, are you okay that you don't need her acceptance to be good, feel good about yourself?
Yeah, I'm kind of past that point now. I mean,
Oh,
I'm
good.
a year into this, and I'm considering surgeries and other things, and it's like, the ship has sailed. Like either you're on it or like you'll have to come by like lifeboat later. It's like or motorboat or whatever. You'll just have to like, yeah. So I have to accept it eventually. And the thing is, I feel better because everyone else in my family has accepted this. So
Mhm.
it would be different if my family had split evenly, or especially if they'd split against me. I think the pressure is going to be on her to come around. So I'm not as worried about it.
On holidays, do you go home for holidays like Thanksgiving?
I
And
do.
and, and did you go home as Lorelei? Because
Oh, that's a good question. So actually last Christmas, I kind of decided that I would really begin to do my gender expression as a woman after the main holidays, just to kind of give myself that reprieve. And
uh-huh.
so not really. I mean, this will be, yeah, it's kind of been a while since I've seen them. It'll probably be the first time that they've really seen me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you're beautiful. I mean, I love, you are so, I just have a special place in my heart for you.
Oh, thank you.
We're sort of running out of time and sort of reaching the last 5 minutes. So, Lorelei, you've been bombarded with an enormous amount of questions. Is there anything else on sort of what you're feeling you want to talk about or kind of share about your journey that we haven't
Yeah.
touched on?
There was something that came up a few times that we never quite hit on. And I wanted to talk about dysphoria just a bit more because I said that I started us off at the low end and I wanted to explain what I meant by that. So I like to compare it to anxiety. So everyone knows what anxiety is. It's a feeling of worry, right? You feel worried about something. And that feeling can vary for different people. I think some people are more prone to feeling anxiety, right? And certainly we feel it about different things. Not everyone, you may have like a fear of spiders and the next person doesn't, right? You might be worried about things someone else isn't. But dysphoria, so again, I have gender dysphoria. That sense of just something being off or wrong is the lower end. So if anxiety, the far end would be a panic attack, being, that feeling of worry builds to the point where it just becomes physically overwhelming. The far end of dysphoria I have actually learned is disassociation. It's when the feeling of something being wrong becomes this feeling of just this is surreal, this is even unreal. And I kind of wanted to say, by the time I was in my late teens, by my 20s, I actually couldn't look at myself in the mirror, especially if I had my facial hair, like if I hadn't shaved. A coworker showed me a picture of me like 2 years ago before I started hormone therapy. And I literally sat there looking at that picture. I'm like, I know this has to be me. Like, it can't be the other people in the picture, but there's no way that I ever looked like that. Like, I just,
Mhm.
my mind had so detached from, my body at some point. Like, that physical sense, I've been trying to come forward with it for, and I think body alienation is about the closest I'll get, just totally alien from my own body.
Mhm.
And got worse. I mean, it wasn't the same. So when I was younger, it was just that feeling of it being off or wrong. But by puberty, it was really just, full on. It was way worse.
That
Did
feeling of
did you
seeing yourself in the mirror, is that fear? I mean, you speak about alienation, but is
Mhm.
it fear? Is it a sense of wrong? What is that
Wrongness. It's a sense
feeling?
of wrongness. So I don't know if you've ever had trauma where perhaps you've had it. It is a trauma response. I mean, disassociation is a
Absolutely.
response to severe trauma. You might have something really bad that happens to you, and it feels like you're watching a movie. It doesn't feel like it could be happening. That was the feeling. I wouldn't say it can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, it can certainly lead to other things. Other things can kind of, come out of that feeling. But I ended up realizing that dysphoria, ultimately, the root of it is that feeling of it being off or wrong. It just felt so wrong to me to have the facial hair.
Is that
It felt so
scary, or there's something?
probably initially in puberty, yeah, I would say it was a bit scary, but then you do get used to it, but you get used to ignoring it.
Right.
You get used to
Yeah.
coping with it by just not acknowledging it.
Right. Sorry,
Did,
you.
did you dress up as a child? Was there any?
No, as a matter of fact, I didn't have as much privacy in my home as a child. And we had a lot of communal kind of living spaces. And truth be told, actually, my sense of dysphoria is so profoundly physical that I think doing that would have drawn more attention to my masculine characteristics. And so for me, I didn't do that. And I had reasons why.
That's curious that
Yeah.
dressing up would draw attention to your masculine qualities. What, that you don't have them?
No, more the way in which during puberty I had changed, right? So when I was younger, when you're younger, you don't necessarily, there's not much difference between boys and girls, right? It's when you become older. And would have drawn attention to the ways in which I was changing. And I just was not comfortable with that. It would have drawn attention to my shoulders getting broader, like my body structure, just, all those changes. And I was deeply uncomfortable with that. I did drag for a little bit, and drag was better because drag was full body. Like drag was, you did everything wholesale. But just cross-dressing, or really dressing as, my gender, it wouldn't have helped me until I did HRT.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was right for me, what I did. Yeah.
I think it's fantastic that we're talking to you today and that you're happy, you're still kind, and that you got yourself to this point. I think it's amazing. And I don't know, like, it's my life journey to figure out what it is that makes some people have the strength to just keep going and hold on to those values and choose the kindness, choose the love. So it's amazing. And I'm super happy for you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
me too. Yeah. And I want to check in with you after you meet with Mom to find out, what happened. Just so you know that I'm thinking about you. Okay.
Oh, that's really sweet. Yeah, I'm hoping it goes well. I mean, it might kind of come as a bit of a shock to her, but I'm hoping that I hope that she just moves on. I'm really kind of hoping that my dad is able to, he'll just kind of switch over, and maybe that will pave the way, but we'll see. I have no way of
whatever, Lorelei's here to stay, so.
Yeah. Yep. Thank
we
you.
celebrate that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for getting into this discussion. I hope you leave feeling that it was fun and interesting, and that you got good questions, and that you said what you had hoped to say before we started.
Absolutely. And I hope that you were able to take away something from this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I wish you,
I sure did.
it is a long journey ahead, but I wish you a lot of sweetness on that journey and a lot of joy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Love to you both, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Bye, Lorelei. Bye, Haley.
Bye.
Bye.